April 7th, 1945, Tokyo Bay, Japan. As the first light of dawn touches the calm waters, 91 silver P-51D Mustangs slice through the morning sky. They belong to the 15th and 21st Fighter Groups, flying low and steady toward their rendezvous point. Inside one of them sits Major James B. Tapp, his gloved hand tight on the control stick. Beneath each wing, 650 caliber Browning M2 machine guns wait, armed with armor-piercing incendiary rounds. Early Mustangs like his carried a staggering 2,800 rounds, 500 for the inner guns, 270 for the outer, enough firepower to turn steel and sky into chaos. Later versions would carry fewer bullets, sacrificing volume for reliability. Far below, Mount Fuji rises in silent perfection, its snow-white crown glowing under the newborn sun. Pilots often used that mountain as a compass, a natural beacon above the land they'd never flown over before. The light spreads across Japan's countryside, revealing fields, quiet villages, and hidden air bases that had never seen an American fighter until this very morning. This mission was unlike any before it, a long-range escort deep into Japan's heartland. Their job: protect B-29 superfortresses on a raid launched from an island base 750 miles away. Only 2 years earlier, experts had said such a thing couldn't be done with single-engine planes. Yet here they were, proving everyone wrong. At 0700 hours, the calm is shattered. Over 100 Japanese interceptors climb toward the Americans. From the haze emerges a sight that freezes the defenders in disbelief: single-engine U.S. fighters above Tokyo. Their commanders had sworn this was impossible. The shock hits like a hammer. These weren't carrier fighters from the Navy. These were land-based Army Air Force Mustangs that had somehow crossed the endless Pacific. To reach the imperial capital, the Japanese scramble their best, the Nakajima. Ki-84 Hayate, swift and deadly, flying beside older Ki-43 Hayabusas, Ki-44 Shokis, Ki-61 Hin fighters, and even N-1K2J Shidens. The Ki-84 could outclimb and outturn the American planes under the right conditions. But what followed would show the staggering difference between Japan's shrinking resources and America's industrial might. The Mustang, the sleek, long-range predator born from North American Aviation's design tables, had already earned its fame over Europe, where it broke the back of the Luftwaffe and made daylight bombing possible again. Originally built for Britain and transformed by the legendary Rolls-Royce Merlin engine, it became something far greater. The fighter that could fly farther, fight longer, and change the course of the war. The story of the Mustang's transformation is one of aviation's greatest success tales, a rare moment when two nations' genius came together to change the air war forever. What began as a good aircraft powered by an Allison engine became extraordinary when the British Rolls-Royce Merlin was fitted to its sleek American frame. It was a perfect marriage, British power meeting American design, and the result was the P-51D Mustang, a long-range, high-altitude fighter that could fly with heavy bombers all the way to Berlin. And now, unbelievably, from Iwo Jima to Tokyo and back again. At its heart roared the Packard-built V-1657, a U.S.-made version of the Merlin 66. With water injection, it pushed out nearly 1,300 horsepower and could surge to over 1,220 in emergencies. Its two-stage, two-speed supercharger gave it lungs strong enough to breathe at 40,000 feet, while Japanese engines choked thin air through their single-stage systems. The numbers were stunning. The P-51D could race at roughly 440 miles per hour at 25,000 feet and climb to a ceiling near 42,000. Its 650 caliber Browning M2 machine guns, 3 in each wing, gave it a bite as lethal as its speed. Each gun spat out about 800 rounds a minute, unleashing a combined storm of nearly 80 bullets every second. Each armor-piercing incendiary slug, weighing 46 grams and moving at nearly 3,000 feet per second, could rip through steel, explode fuel tanks, or tear an engine apart with only a handful of hits. By the close of 1944, 14 out of 15 fighter squadrons in the U.S. 8th Air Force were flying Mustangs. Proof enough that no other fighter could match its reach or reliability. And behind that dominance stood the raw industrial power of the United States. In California and Texas, North American Aviation's factories thundered around the clock. At their production peak, a brand new Mustang rolled off the line every single hour. When the war finally ended, 15,586 Mustangs had been built, over half of them the P-51D model. To put that in perspective, Japan's entire output of fighter aircraft during the last 2 years of the war didn't even come close. The Mustang wasn't just a machine. It was a symbol of what happened when technology, courage, and relentless production came together at the perfect moment in history. The Mustang's arrival over Tokyo wasn't just another mission. It marked a revolution in how fighter aircraft were used. For the first time in history, single-engine fighters could travel deep into enemy territory and come back again. With a pair of 110-gallon drop tanks hanging beneath its wings, the P-51 could fly more than 1,500 miles round-trip without refueling, and some daring pilot stretched that to 1,600. To imagine it, think of taking off from Los Angeles and flying all the way to Little Rock, Arkansas, over nothing but open ocean, with no safety net except the sea below. That kind of reach didn't come from luck. It was the result of brilliant engineering. The Merlin engine sipped fuel efficiently, burning only about 65 gallons an hour at cruising speed. Combined with the Mustang's sleek laminar flow wing, designed by North American's aerodynamicist Edgar Schmood, drag was reduced by more than a third compared to earlier fighters. The air flowed clean and smooth across the wing, delaying turbulence and squeezing every extra mile out of each drop of fuel. While American innovation soared, Japan was running out of time and resources. Their answer to the Mustang was the Nakajima Ki-84 Hayate, Gale to the Japanese, Frank to the Allies. It entered combat in mid-1944, too late and in too few numbers to change the war's course. The Hayate was fast, agile, and well-armed, Japan's best hope to claw back the skies. It carried a deadly mix of two 30mm Ho-155 cannons and two 20mm Ho-5 cannons, weapons that could tear through American bombers. But its ammunition load told another story. Only 50 rounds per 30mm gun, and 150 per 20mm, barely 400 rounds in total. The Mustang, by contrast, carried nearly 2,000. On paper, the Hayate looked formidable, even superior in bursts. Its Nakajima Ha-45 Homar engine, an 18-cylinder radial beast, used fuel injection and a 2-speed supercharger aided by water methanol injection to push out around 2,000 horsepower at takeoff. But the complexity of its design, coupled with Japan's dwindling materials and limited production capacity, meant that few of these aircraft ever left the factory floor. What Japan called mass production, America would have called a prototype batch, and that contrast between ambition and capacity told the real story of the air war's final year. At first, the Hayate seemed like a miracle in the making. Early test flights clocked speeds near 387 miles per hour, and under perfect conditions, with the best fuel and meticulous tuning, pilots claimed it could even touch 427. On paper, it looked ready to rival anything America could put in the sky. But the reality of Japan's collapsing war industry told a very different story. By 1944, Japan's factories were shadows of what they had once been, battered by B-29 bombers, short on skilled labor, and starved of quality metals. The Nakajima Homari engine, the heart of the Hayate, demanded precision machining and top-grade steel to perform as designed. Instead, it received hurried assembly, uneven materials, and little chance for proper testing. What should have been a powerful, high-tech 18-cylinder masterpiece turned into a maintenance nightmare. Pilots quickly learned to treat their aircraft like fragile glass. Engines overheated or seized mid-flight, and landing gear, built from weak, improperly heat-treated steel, had a nasty habit of folding during landings. Each collapse destroyed a plane Japan couldn't replace, and often killed the pilot inside. A tragedy for a nation that could barely train new airmen fast enough to fill empty cockpits. The Hayate's technical flaws mirrored Japan's broader collapse. The empire had built its war strategy on a short, decisive conflict, and when that gamble failed, its industry began to unravel. Meanwhile, across the Pacific, American production not only surged but improved. Even as factories worked around the clock, quality went up, not down. Each new Mustang or Super Fortress rolled off the line better built, more reliable, more refined. For Japan, the decline was brutal. Late in the war, no two aircraft performed the same. Some could barely take off. Others couldn't climb high enough to reach the B-29's bombing from 30,000 feet. Pilots never knew if their engine would hold together, if the guns would jam, or if the brakes would even work on landing. By 1945, only about 500 Hayates had been produced, and half of those never left the ground. Many sat idle for lack of fuel, spare parts, or trained crews. The fuel crisis alone spoke volumes. America's fighters ran on pure high-octane gasoline shipped straight from refineries in Texas and California, a liquid engineered for power. Japan's planes, on the other hand, ran on desperation. Their fuel, often synthesized from coal, tested at 87 octane or worse, sometimes as low as 80. Engines coughed, sputtered, and tore themselves apart from pre-ignition before ever reaching combat. By then, Japan's war machine wasn't just outmatched. It was running on fumes by early 1945. Japan's fuel crisis had become so desperate that air units resorted to strange and often tragic improvisations. Mechanics tried to stretch dwindling supplies by mixing aviation fuel with pine root oil, alcohol distilled from sweet potatoes, even the leftover mash from sake breweries. The results were disastrous. Engines coughed and sputtered, some barely starting, others shaking apart mid-air. Pilots took off knowing their power plants might fail before they ever saw an enemy. On that cold, clear morning of April 7th, the Americans launched what would become one of the most daring missions of the Pacific War. 91 Mustangs climbed into formation beside their heavy companions, 103 B-29. Super Fortresses of the 73rd Bomb? Wing? Each bomber packed with incendiary loads meant for Japan's factories and war plants. Captain Art Bridge of the 45th Fighter Squadron would later describe the sight with wonder. "It was unbelievable," he said. The B-29s were finishing their assembly in a huge circle as we joined up. The sun hit their aluminum skins and they looked like a school of giant silver fish swimming across the sky. That rendezvous was more than a beautiful moment. It was a technical miracle. The P-51s had flown 750 miles over open ocean, guided mostly by dead reckoning and simple radio compasses, and still managed to meet the bombers within minutes of schedule. They climbed slowly to 25,000 feet, their engines automatically adjusting fuel mixture as altitude rose, superchargers switching seamlessly into high gear to keep power steady. Then came the coast of Honshu and the first glimpse of enemy aircraft. As the Mustangs dropped their 110-gallon fuel tanks to lighten up for combat, the silver canisters tumbled toward the earth below, flashing in the sun before exploding or bouncing across the rice fields. Moments later, the sky filled with specks, over 100 Japanese fighters racing to intercept. They came from every direction: Ki-84 Hayates, Ki-43 Oscars, Ki-44 Tojos, Ki-61 Hyans, and Navy fighters including Zeros and the newer N-1K-2J Shiden Kai. But what they saw left them stunned. These weren't Navy carrier fighters from some offshore fleet. These were American land-based Mustangs, somehow here over the Japanese homeland, when every commander had sworn such a thing was impossible. Flight Sergeant Totona Mizu, of the 56th Sentai, later recalled that moment with disbelief. When they told us enemy fighters were approaching Tokyo, we laughed. We thought they meant bombers, but when I saw the Mustangs with my own eyes, I thought I was dreaming. Our officers promised us no American fighter could ever reach Japan. Yet there they were, flying above us as if they owned the sky. In that moment I knew the war was lost. Leading the charge that morning was Major James B. Tapp, who would go on to earn ace status with 8 confirmed victories. In his after-action report written just hours later, his words were calm, precise, the tone of a man describing history in real time. They came at us in their old 3-plane V formation, a classic move, but this time it fell apart fast. The lead pilot would dive in, guns blazing, yet his wingmen hesitated, drifting out of position or failing to follow up. You could sense something was off. Maybe they were short on fuel, running low on ammo or simply green, the kind of inexperience that gets men killed. We cut straight through them, using our 100-mile-an-hour speed edge. A quick burst here, a short spray there, and we'd zoom back up before they even had a chance to react. What we saw that day wasn't just poor flying. It was a sign of how far Japan's Air Force had fallen. By 1945, their veteran pilots, the ones who once ruled the skies, were gone, lost over the Solomons, New Guinea, the Philippines, and the Marianas. The replacements coming up behind them were barely trained, 50 hours in the air before being thrown into combat. Compare that to the 600 hours we logged before ever seeing a dogfight. When we finally landed back at Iwo Jima, the tally was staggering. 26 Japanese planes down, 1 probable, and 5 more damaged. We lost 2 P-51s and 1 pilot, a 13-to-1 kill ratio on our first mission, and that number would only climb higher. As our men grew sharper and their pilots weaker, the ratio soared to 20-to-1, sometimes even 30-to-1. It wasn't just better machines or better tactics anymore. It was desperation on one side and dominance on the other. The difference between aircraft became painfully clear at altitude, that vertical space where modern air battles were now decided. Above 20,000 feet, the P-51D Mustang ruled the sky. Its Merlin engine, with a 2-stage supercharger, delivered full power as if it were still flying at sea level. Meanwhile, Japanese engines gasped for air, their single-stage superchargers unable to keep up. Without a second compression stage or an intercooler, their power dropped off sharply, exactly where they needed it most. At 30,000 feet, their best fighter, the Ki-84, struggled to stay at 350 miles per hour, while our Mustangs were still pushing 420. Lieutenant Jerry Yellen of the 78th Fighter Squadron remembered those encounters vividly. We'd see them clawing up toward us, he said, dark exhaust pouring behind them as they jammed their throttles wide open. But by 25,000 feet, they were done. Their planes started wallowing like fish out of water, engines choking, coughing black smoke. Running too rich because the superchargers just couldn't keep up. We came down through their formation like thunder, 650s blazing. The tracers streaked ahead of us, bright fiery lines that looked almost like laser beams cutting through the air. They simply couldn't match our speed in the dive or the way we rocketed back up afterward. You could hear the Merlin engine screaming with life as we pulled against the Gs, bodies pressed deep into our seats, while their radial engines coughed and struggled just to stay lit. The P-51D could hit nearly 500 miles an hour in a dive and still hold control, its laminar flow wings biting the air, even as we brushed the edge of the transonic range. Japanese fighters, on the other hand, were never built for that kind of punishment. Push them past 400, and things got ugly fast. Control reversal, airframes twisting, wings tearing away under the strain. It wasn't just technology failing them. It was training too. The gap between us grew wider by the day. When new American pilots arrived at Iwo Jima, most had 400 to 600 flight hours under their belts, over 100 in the Mustang itself. They'd fired thousands of rounds in gunnery practice, flown countless mock dogfights, and trained under veterans who'd already survived years of war. They knew how to fly in tight formation without a word, could navigate by instruments through storms, and mastered deflection shooting until it was pure instinct. Every move in the sky was drilled, tested, and lived. The Japanese pilots facing us in 1945 had none of that. Many had less than 100 hours total, some barely 30. Ammunition shortages meant they rarely practiced gunnery at all. Their instrument flying was minimal, and tactics were learned not from combat-tested leaders but from instruction manuals, because the teachers were either dead or still fighting. On the front lines, even navigation separated the living from the doomed. Flying a single-engine fighter 1,500 miles over open ocean wasn't just about skill. It took faith in your plane, your instruments, and your team. We had all three. Our routes were mapped with the help of submarine weather reports and aerial reconnaissance. Our instruments were precise, our briefings detailed. And if something went wrong, we had rescue submarines, lifeguard league boats, waiting beneath our path, plus PBY Catalinas ready to scoop up anyone forced to ditch. The Japanese had none of that safety net. They flew with outdated maps that didn't show bombed-out landmarks, unreliable compasses that hadn't been calibrated in months, and no hope of rescue if they went down. For them, the ocean wasn't a backdrop. It was a grave waiting just beneath the waves. If a Japanese pilot went down over the Pacific, his chances of survival were almost zero. Most had no working life rafts, and the few that did were often patched, leaking, or already used as food containers back at base during shortages. Emergency rations were long gone. The sea below wasn't a safety net. It was a silent grave waiting to claim another young man. For the Americans, luck and geography worked hand in hand. The magnetic difference between Iwo Jima and Tokyo in 1945 was only about 3 degrees west. That meant a pilot who lost his bearings in combat could simply fly south-southeast, and with luck and fuel, spot Mount Suribachi rising like a dark pyramid from the endless blue. That small miracle of geography saved dozens of airmen who might otherwise have vanished into the ocean forever. Behind those long-range missions stood the staggering machinery of American industry. Every day, nearly 100 Mustangs lifted off from Iwo Jima, drinking down 57,000 gallons of high-octane fuel and firing through over 200,000 rounds of .50 caliber ammunition. And that was just one base, one day's effort. 3 full fighter groups operated from that tiny volcanic island, all supplied by a logistical web that stretched thousands of miles across the Pacific. Fuel from Texas, engines from Detroit, bullets from Missouri. Everything moved by Liberty ships rolling off American shipyards at a pace of 3 a day. C-54 transports flew steady cargo runs, bringing in crates of spare parts, mail, food, and the small comforts that kept men sane between missions. The Japanese side was the opposite, a picture of collapse. Their logistics had crumbled into chaos. Fuel was so scarce that training flights were canceled outright. New pilots went into battle without recent flight time, sometimes barely remembering how their planes handled. Ammunition was rationed. They were told to fire only when sure of a kill. The Army and Navy, never cooperative even in peacetime, now fought each other for scraps. A few barrels of fuel, a handful of tires, a crate of spark plugs. Mechanics stripped grounded planes bare to keep a few others flying, until airfields were littered with hollow metal skeletons. Some desperate units even tried to forge their own spare parts in makeshift workshops. The results as crude and unreliable as their situation. And the difference didn't stop at machines. American pilots flew with advanced flight suits that kept blood from draining during high-G maneuvers. Their oxygen systems worked flawlessly at 30,000 feet, feeding them clean air through automatic regulators. VHF radios gave crystal-clear communication across multiple channels. Parachutes were inspected regularly, rafts sealed and stocked with working radios, morphine, and even fishing gear. For Japanese pilots, those things were dreams, luxuries from another world. They fought bravely, but against an enemy powered by a nation that could build, fuel, and fly faster than anyone in history. The outcome was already written, in oil, in steel, and in blood. Most Japanese pilots entered combat at a staggering disadvantage before they ever saw an enemy. Their radios, built around fragile vacuum tubes, drained power fast and often failed completely. Many went into battle unable to communicate with their own squadron. Their oxygen systems were unreliable too, prone to freezing or clogging above 20,000 feet. When they failed, pilots grew lightheaded, confused, and sometimes simply passed out. And without G-suits, even the most experienced flyers blacked out under heavy maneuvering. Their vision narrowing to darkness while American pilots pressed on, unshaken. But nature could humble anyone, even the Americans. On June 1, 1945, a mission that should have been routine turned into a nightmare. It would be remembered as Black Friday. Around 150 Mustangs were en route to Osaka when they flew headlong into a wall of cloud, a massive weather front that no one had predicted. Within minutes, radio chatter dissolved into chaos. 27 aircraft vanished. 24 of those weren't lost to the enemy, but to the sky itself. Some collided inside the clouds. Some ran out of fuel searching for clear air. Others simply disappeared without a trace. Pilots described it later as flying blind inside a living storm. The turbulence was savage. Ice built up on wings. Lightning crawled across canopies. And blue fire, St. Elmo's fire, danced on metal surfaces as compasses spun wildly and artificial horizons toppled uselessly. Even the best instruments couldn't make sense of the storm's violence. That single day proved that even the most advanced machines in the world had limits. And so did the men who flew them. For the Japanese, the psychological impact was devastating. Captain Yoshio Yoshida, one of the few surviving Ki-84 pilots of the 47th Sentai, later wrote in his diary, "The sight of American fighters over Tokyo broke our spirit completely. We were told the B-29s could not reach us with escorts. Yet the Mustangs came, over the palace itself, strafing our runways in daylight, shooting down our best men like novices. Their confidence was unbearable. We knew then. The war was over. We were already dead. Long-range missions like these weren't just tests of combat skill. They were trials of endurance." Major James Tapp, recalling those flights years later, said the real enemy wasn't always the Japanese. It was the ocean, the monotony, and the exhaustion. You'd sit there for 8 hours straight, he remembered. Nowhere to stand, nowhere to move. The sea below never changed, just blue, endless blue. You checked your compass every few minutes, praying it was right. You couldn't even relieve yourself properly. The tube would freeze solid at altitude. These missions pushed both man and machine to their absolute breaking point. Victory in the air came not just from courage, but from surviving the silence, the cold, and the distance between one heartbeat and the next. They endured pain that crept into every muscle, legs cramping like iron rods, feet tingling as if stabbed by needles, and backs so numb that many wondered if they'd ever walk properly again. The Mustang cockpit was a metal cocoon, hot, noisy, and vibrating. Yet it was home for 8 relentless hours over an endless blue void where one mechanical hiccup could mean a watery grave. Flying a single-engine fighter over the Pacific wasn't just dangerous. It was a psychological trial. Every sound, every flicker of the gauges carried the silent question, what if the engine quits now? But if any aircraft gave a man a fighting chance, it was the P-51D Mustang. Its cockpit design, born from 3 years of war and thousands of pilot reports, represented the peak of human-centered engineering. The new bubble canopy wrapped around the pilot like glass armor, offering an unobstructed 360-degree view of the world outside. For the first time, a fighter pilot could actually look back over his shoulder and see death coming, and sometimes avoid it. Every control was positioned with purpose. The seat and pedals could be adjusted to fit pilots of every build. The throttle, trim, and radio were placed within effortless reach. The most vital instruments, airspeed, altitude, manifold pressure, and coolant temperature, sat directly in the pilot's line of sight, reducing fatigue and allowing instant reactions in combat. Across the Pacific, Japanese pilots fought with what they had, and what they had was not enough. The cockpit of the Ki-84 Hayate, though a step forward from earlier Japanese designs like the Zero, still suffered from fatal flaws. Rearward visibility was blocked by metal framing and the fuel tank behind the pilot's head. Controls were awkwardly positioned, forcing flyers to take one hand off the stick during critical moments. Instruments vibrated so violently in combat that they blurred into uselessness. Then came the matter of firepower, the thin red line between survival and a smoking crater. On paper, the Hayate's cannons looked formidable, but in the chaos of a dogfight, numbers meant nothing if the guns jammed or ran dry too soon. The Mustang's 650 caliber Browning machine guns told a different story. They were brutally reliable, mechanical poetry in motion. Properly maintained by American armorers, their failure rate was less than 1%. Each Mustang carried nearly 1,100 rounds, enough to fight multiple engagements. Japanese pilots, by contrast, flew with barely 400 rounds total. A few seconds of firing, and they were out. This difference, invisible on a blueprint, decided who lived and who died. Mustang pilots could take a ranging shot, adjust, fire again. Japanese pilots had to make every round count, often forced to break away before landing a single hit. The battle between the Mustang and the Hayate wasn't just about speed or altitude, It was about design philosophy itself. One side built for endurance, precision, and the man behind the stick. The other, trapped by scarcity, built for hope. And by 1945, hope was running out of fuel. American pilots knew their .50 caliber machine guns like the back of their hand. They could judge distance, lead targets perfectly, and hit an enemy plane from 400 yards away without hesitation. The Japanese pilots, by contrast, were juggling mixed cannons and machine guns, each round behaving differently, making accurate long-range shooting almost impossible. Training made all the difference. U.S. flyers spent countless hours in the air, firing thousands of rounds, practicing deflection shooting, gunnery on towed targets, and simulated dogfights until the movements became second nature. Japanese pilots in 1945 were lucky to fire 100 rounds before heading into combat. Often their first time shooting at an enemy was while someone was actively trying to shoot them down. The final fights near Tokyo on August 10, 1945, were almost symbolic. The 15th and 56th Fighter Groups claimed 7 kills in one of the last air battles of the war. By then, Japanese resistance was nearly non-existent, a hollow shadow of the force that had once dominated the Pacific. Fuel shortages had grounded most aircraft, leaving only a few planes in the air, often piloted by teenage boys barely out of high school. Meanwhile, EWO's Mustangs had racked up an astonishing 206 confirmed kills from April through August, accounting for roughly 3/4 of all Pacific P-51 victories. The true total was likely even higher, as countless Japanese aircraft went down in forests or cities and were never counted. But the impact went far beyond numbers. With Mustangs patrolling the skies, B-29 bombers could strike Japanese cities during daylight with devastating precision, reducing factories to rubble and crippling industrial production already weakened by shortages and constant raids. Civilians witnessed American fighters strafing trains, attacking ships in Tokyo Bay, and overwhelming airfields, proof that Japan no longer controlled its skies. The legend of the divine wind, the kamikaze spirit that had supposedly shielded the homeland, was shattered when Mustangs soared over the Imperial Palace itself. Lieutenant Colonel John R. Morgan of the 457th Fighter Squadron flew specialized P-51s equipped with cameras instead of guns to assess Japanese air strength. What he saw was staggering. Airfields rumored to hold hundreds of planes had maybe a dozen airworthy aircraft. The rest were gutted, stripped for parts, or sitting as empty shells. Some desperate crews had even pushed old wrecks around to make it look like more planes were operational. In a few cases, Japanese engineers tried to fool the Americans with wooden decoys, complete with painted markings, while real planes cowered in revetments or under camouflage. The collapse of Japan's air power was total, and the Mustang's dominance in the skies was undeniable. The numbers told the story of the war more clearly than any report ever could. The United States cranked out 15,586 P-51s of all variants, a staggering total that dwarfed Japan's entire aircraft production for 1944 and 1945 combined. Japan managed only about 3,500 Ki-84s, and even those were often destroyed on the ground by B-29 raids, lost in training accidents caused by shoddy manufacturing, or left grounded because parts simply didn't exist. Meanwhile, American factories were hitting full stride. North American Aviation alone was rolling out 20 new P-51s every single day, more than Japan produced Ki-84s in an entire month. Every Mustang was essentially identical, built with interchangeable parts, while Japanese planes varied wildly in quality, even from one batch to the next. The pilot training programs told the same story. By 1945, the U.S. was producing 30,000 trained aviators each year. Each pilot received 200 to 300 hours of flight instruction before moving on to advanced fighter training, and then another 100 hours of combat practice. Japan's training pipeline, in contrast, had almost completely collapsed. New pilots were lucky to see 50 hours before being thrust into combat, often much less. In the brutal arithmetic of war, the advantage was overwhelming. America could replace losses quickly, without compromising skill or readiness. Japan could not. For every pilot Japan trained, the U.S. trained 10, and American pilots were far better prepared. Fuel consumption further exposed the strategic reality. Each P-51 mission from Iwo burned roughly 600 gallons of high-octane aviation fuel per plane, combining internal tanks and drop tanks. With 100 aircraft flying daily, that added up to 60,000 gallons for a single fighter group every day. America's supply lines delivered millions of gallons each month across the Pacific, a literal river of fuel keeping the air war alive. Japan, by contrast, scrambled to extract aviation fuel from pine roots, needing 200 stumps to produce a single gallon of barely usable fuel, and even converting training planes into kamikaze aircraft simply because they had no fuel for conventional operations. By August 1945, the imbalance was complete. Industrial might, pilot skill, and raw resources had all shifted decisively in favor of the United States. By the final months of the war, Japan had less than 200,000 gallons of aviation fuel left across the home islands, barely enough for a single major operation. In contrast, the P-51D wasn't just a plane. It was a symbol of an entire approach to warfare. Every Mustang rolling off the assembly line reflected American philosophy. Mass production paired with strict quality control, standardization across factories, and constant improvement based on combat experience. Pilots could climb into any P-51D and immediately know how it would respond, exactly where every switch and gauge was, and how it would perform. Japanese aircraft, meanwhile, were becoming increasingly improvised. Factories used substitute materials and hand-built components, producing planes that varied wildly in performance, even within the same production batch. One Ki-84 might reach 400 mi, while another from the same plant could barely push 350. Reliability was unpredictable, and maintenance often meant improvisation under impossible conditions. Brigadier General Ernest M. Moore, commander of the 7th Fighter Command, summed it up succinctly. "I don't believe there is any question about the P-51 being the best prop fighter of World War II. It was our top air escort and as capable as the P-47 for ground attack. The assessment wasn't just about speed or firepower. It reflected endurance, reliability, and adaptability. A P-51D could be refueled and rearmed in just 30 minutes, fly twice in a single day if needed, and operate from rough coral airstrips that would have destroyed more fragile aircraft. Maintenance statistics underscored the advantage. At Iwo, P-51Ds maintained operational rates above 80% despite harsh conditions. Volcanic dust infiltrating every surface, salt air corroding aluminum, and minimal facilities forcing crews to work outdoors. Engine swaps could be completed in 4 hours, using mobile cranes and standardized procedures. And battle damage that would ground a Japanese fighter for weeks could often be repaired overnight, with prefabricated parts flown in from the US. By comparison, Ki-84s, even when fuel and ammunition were available, often suffered serviceability rates below 40%, and sometimes as low as 20%. Their complex Humar engines required specialized tools that rarely existed, skilled technicians who were mostly gone, and spare parts that had to be hand-fitted due to poor manufacturing tolerances. Weather reconnaissance added another crucial edge. Dedicated B-29s flew ahead of American fighter missions, mapping clouds, wind speeds, and frontal systems. This allowed flight planners to route missions around the worst conditions, saving countless lives. Japanese forces, lacking such capabilities, often flew blind into weather that shredded entire formations. Even with all the technology in the world, weather remained unpredictable, as Black Friday proved, but the Americans' ability to plan and avoid the worst storms kept losses far lower than their adversaries. While Japanese units were being hammered by deadly storms and weather-related accidents, the Americans were operating with a communication and rescue network that was decades ahead of its time. High-frequency radio beacons broadcast from submarines and island bases, guiding fighters across hundreds of miles of open ocean. Submarine rescue teams could direct search aircraft to downed pilots, while real-time weather updates allowed missions to adjust on the fly. Pilots knew that if something went wrong, someone would be coming for them. That sense of security was invaluable. Japanese pilots, by contrast, often flew with broken radios, unreliable instruments, and zero chance of rescue if they went down. Every sortie carried a near-certain death sentence. Farewell rituals before takeoff weren't symbolic. They were literal goodbyes, with crews expecting that many of their friends would never return. Captain Harry Krim Jr., later credited with 7 kills over Japan, put it bluntly, "We owned the skies over Japan. We could go where we wanted when we wanted. The Japanese knew it, we knew it, and most importantly, the civilians knew it. Every Mustang over Tokyo was proof that Japan had already lost. We weren't fighting for air superiority anymore, we had it. We were just showing them." These very long-range missions rewrote the rules of the Pacific War. Japan could no longer rely on distance to protect its homeland. The geographic buffer that had kept their industrial centers mostly safe for 3 years was gone. Every American fighter overhead was a stark reminder that no place in Japan was untouchable. The myth of the divine wind, the kamikaze wind that supposedly shielded the islands, was shattered. Daily attacks over Tokyo and other cities made clear that defeat was no longer a possibility. It was inevitable. The human cost of this technological imbalance was brutally clear. Between July 1st and August 15, 1945, the Americans lost 85 fighter pilots on very long-range missions, but only a handful, maybe 5 or 6, fell to enemy aircraft. Most died because of the unforgiving environment, extreme weather, mechanical failure, navigational errors, or sheer exhaustion pushing them to fatal mistakes. Japanese losses in the same window were staggering. Hundreds, possibly over 1,000 pilots. Entire squadrons wiped out in desperate attempts to intercept formations they could neither match in skill nor technology. The numbers alone told the story. Technology, logistics, and training had made victory all but certain for the Americans, and tragic for those fighting on the other side. By August 1945, the story of Japan's Air Force had become a tragic tale of attrition and exhaustion. The 47th Centi, which had started April with 40 skilled pilots, was down to just 3. The 244th Centi had been wiped out entirely, briefly rebuilt with new recruits, and then destroyed again. The final dogfights over Japan weren't battles. They were the last flickers of a force already defeated. On August 14, 1945, August 15th in Japan because of the time difference, Lieutenant Jerry Yellen took to the skies on what would become the last combat mission of World War II, alongside his 19-year-old wingman, Second Lieutenant Philip Schlamberg. He attacked airfields near Nagoya. The mission had been planned before the news of Japan's surrender reached Iwima. The recall code, Utah, never arrived. Yellen and Schlamberg strafed their targets, banking into clouds to escape anti-aircraft fire. When Yellen emerged, Schlamberg was gone, brought down by ground fire. History records him as the last American killed in aerial combat during the war. Even as the war's end had been broadcast across Japan, anti-aircraft guns continued to fire with desperate determination. What was missing, however, were Japanese fighters. They had all but vanished, grounded for lack of fuel, pilots, or simply destroyed in earlier engagements. The truth of the air war was written in steel and blood. The numbers were final, indisputable, and devastating. The P-51D Mustang, with its 440 mph top speed, 2,000-mile range with drop tanks, and 6 reliable 50-caliber machine guns loaded with nearly 2,000 rounds, had rendered Japan's home islands defenseless against daylight attack. The K-84 Hayate, despite the bravery of its pilots and impressive theoretical performance, could never compete. Japan lacked the numbers, the maintenance, and most critically, the trained pilots to mount any meaningful defense. Victory was not just decided over Tokyo. It was determined in Detroit's factories, Texas's oil fields, and the vast logistical networks that supplied American air power. The P-51D embodied the industrial and technological strength of the United States, achieving what years of naval blockade and island hopping alone could not: the complete destruction of Japan's ability to defend its skies. By the time the B-29s dropped atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, no fighter escort was needed, not because it wasn't available, but because Japanese air power had been swept from the sky entirely, crushed by unmatched American technology, training, and production. Of the 3514 K-84s ever built, only a single aircraft survives today. It rests quietly in the Chiran Peace Museum in Kagoshima, Japan, a lonely testament to a desperate attempt to match American air power that never succeeded. Meanwhile, hundreds of P-51 Mustangs still exist around the world, preserved in museums, private collections, and even flying at air shows. Their Merlin engines roar to life, echoing a triumph of American industry more than 70 years after these planes first tore through the skies over Tokyo. The contrast in survival tells a story in itself. American aircraft were built to endure, meticulously maintained and valued as history. Japanese fighters, by contrast, were designed to be expendable, made to be used once and destroyed. For Japanese pilots seeing P-51s over Tokyo, the shock went far beyond the tactical. It was the dawning realization that American industrial and technological power could make the impossible routine. Single-engine fighters flying 2,500-mile missions, arriving ready to fight for hours and returning safely home. This was beyond what Japan could comprehend or replicate. The Mustang over Mount Fuji was more than a plane. It was a symbol of American industrial might, of technological innovation, and of the unforgiving mathematics of total war. The lesson it delivered was blunt and unyielding. In industrialized warfare, superior technology multiplied by massive production determines victory. The P-51D represented the United States at its peak. Over 15,000 aircraft built to identical standards, flown by well-trained pilots, backed by limitless logistics, and deployed with deadly precision. Against that, the K-84 Hayate, courageous as its pilots were, simply could not compete. The appearance of American fighters over Tokyo was, in truth, a confrontation with reality itself. It was the realization that even the legendary kamikaze attacks and the revered warrior spirit could not overcome the combined force of production, technology, and strategy. By the time B-29s dropped atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, they flew unescorted, not because no fighter cover existed, but because Japanese air power had been annihilated. The Mustangs executed their mission with relentless efficiency. They proved that distance is no shield, that industrial might outweighs individual valor, and that technological superiority, when properly applied, is absolute. Japanese pilots learned a harsh truth in those final months. Courage alone cannot overcome the mathematics of modern warfare. The P-51D over Tokyo marked the end of one era and the beginning of another. The age of the samurai had given way to the age of the production line, the supercharger, and the long-range fighter escort. The fabled divine wind had been tamed by science, the warrior spirit challenged by industrial might, and the empire of the rising sun overshadowed by wings of aluminum and engines of steel.